Hello, everybody, and welcome to Navigating Peer Review on your first book. Thank you for being here. My name is Kathy Hannebeck. I'm the founder and CEO of Ideas on Fire, the academic editing and indexing agency that helps interdisciplinary scholars turn brilliant ideas into publishable and often field-shaping books. I'm very excited to welcome you to the fourth in our 6-session series on first book publishing, which walks you through every stage of that kind of first book journey, from proposal to publication and beyond. And across these sessions, I'm joined by acquisitions editors, editorial directors, production editors, marketing directors, and series editors from more than a dozen leading university presses. And we're all here to demystify the first book publishing process. At Ideas on Fire, we've helped hundreds of scholars refine their book proposals and their book manuscripts, strengthen their arguments, and ultimately bring those books into the world. And I know how much thought and care goes into first books in particular. They're often tenure books, but not exclusively. And I really like helping people navigate that process. So I'm very excited to be in conversation here today with Elizabeth Ault, who's the Senior Acquisitions Editor at Duke University Press, as well as Sean Vigil, an Acquisitions Editor at Temple University Press. Rachel Fudge, who some of you might already know, is Ideas on Fire's editorial director. She's also with us. She will be active in the chat and providing tech support. So the three of us are here today to demystify a stage of the book publishing process that is both intellectually rigorous, but also can be quite emotionally intense. Peer review really is where your book manuscript stops being only yours and starts becoming a book that can live in the world. So I will say during the session, if you have questions for any of our speakers, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit those, and we'll have time at the end of our session today to get to some of those. So to get us started, I want to briefly ground us in what peer review is and also maybe what it's not, before we turn to how both Duke and Temple structure their particular review processes. So peer review is a defining feature of scholarly publishing. I would say it's the defining feature of scholarly publishing. And it's the stage where your work is evaluated by subject matter experts who understand your fields, who understand the debates that you're wanting to be part of, and who understand the stakes of the intervention that you're making. Now, unlike most other forms of book publishing, academic books are shaped not just by presses and editors, but by that kind of sustained engagement from fellow scholars. And at most academic publishers, a full book manuscript is sent to 2 or 3 external peer reviewers who are professors and scholars in that book's field. Now, I know Liz and Sean will talk a little bit about the particularities of how their presses handle this, but this tends to be the process for most university presses in the United States. So those peer reviewers are typically paid a few $100s in either cash or books, and they're asked to assess the manuscript's scholarly contribution, the soundness of its research and its methodology, and really its fit for that particular press or that particular list. Now, the peer review reports that they write, they give to the acquisitions editor, and they're really designed to offer usually one of 3 recommendations. Accept this book with minimal revisions. That's extremely rare for first books. Revise and resubmit, and reject. And then that acquisitions editor does their own assessment work, kind of weighing those reports and those recommendations, that subject matter familiarity, alongside their own editorial assessment and their publisher needs, their market concerns. And then they present a kind of summary or unified voice to an author about what revisions would be necessary to move forward in the publishing process. I will say that what often first book authors in particular have questions about is that peer review is not a referendum on your worth as a scholar. It's not even a referendum on the quality of the book in question. It really is a structured, generous, ideally generous, conversation about how a book can become clearer, how it can become stronger, and really how it can become more legible to the audiences that you want to reach. And that conversation looks different at different presses, and that's really what we're here to talk about today, is kind of how that breaks down in different contexts. So to maybe start us off, I'd love to hear from both of you about the peer review process at your individual presses. So what do you ask peer reviewers to evaluate in a manuscript? particularly as it pertains to the specific lists that you're building and the types of books that your press seeks to publish.
I thank you for this generous on-ramp and introduction, Kathy, and for the invitation to even be here. Before everyone else logged on, Sean and I were engaged in a pretty significant hype session about how amazing Kathy's work and the work of everyone at Ideas on Fire is, and the space that they're creating for interdisciplinary scholarship, and the community that they're creating around the ideas that are both on fire and under extreme attack right now. And so I'm really grateful for that, and really energized to be here because I do think this is like being able to talk to folks, first book authors, returning authors, people who are out there doing the work every day, is like what's keeping me going in these times. Well, like that and heated rivalry, but that's a different webinar. So, so thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kathy. I just want to take like a quick step back to explain kind of some of the structural function of peer review in terms of like the relationship between a press and an editor, which is that, and I'll speak for myself at Duke. I am not contract Oprah. I cannot be like, look under your chair, you get a contract, you get a book contract, you get a book contract, you get a book contract just because I like your project. For me at Duke, I have to have reports on something in order to be able to request a contract for a book. So in order to be able to make a formal commitment that is something that can go in a tenure file, that is something that can be updated on a CV, that is something that can go in a promotion file, I have to send material out for peer review. And that does vary press to press. And there are things called advanced contracts that, again, that could be a different webinar. But I'll just say for me, I am not sending things out for peer review to be like, is this something? Could this be good? Is there anything here? 95% of the time that I'm sending something out is because I like it. I want to publish it. I think it's a good fit for my press. And I believe in the project. And so I want to find reviewers who will also, as Kathy was saying, believe in the project, help it to connect with its audience, help it to like maybe figure out who its audience is, with reviewers who can narrate the project back to the author and see the possibilities that maybe the author is too in the weeds to see. And I think a lot of people's first experience with peer review is double anonymous journal peer review, which is very different from book peer review, because in book peer review, it's basically impossible to conceal the author's identity. So we don't even try. So the reviewers of your book are going to know who you as the author are. We will keep the reviewers' identities anonymous. The reviewers, of course, can out themselves. But I think in part because of that, and in part because it's a longer commitment and there is a nominal honorarium, not just vibes as in journal peer review, that people are taking this on in a slightly different spirit. I think journal peer review can often be very gatekeepy, can feel very gatekeepy, can also feel like, you're trying to fit into the journal, right? Like you're editing your voice to fit into the journal's voice. Whereas in book peer review, you're honing your voice to connect with your audience and figuring out who that is and what that is. And so I think I have experienced book peer review most of the time as very enabling, energizing, and opportunity. And so I think that a lot of people approach it with fear and trepidation because of some of maybe those like reviewer two experiences that are often discussed on social media, which I think more often come from journals. But I love peer review. I see it as an opportunity to get to share projects that I'm excited about and to make formal commitments. So I just wanted to start by saying like that is another part of the function of peer review, just in the life of a relationship between a book and a press, is for me to be able to put a book under contract, I need to send something out for peer review. So that's just kind of where we start from here. And Sean, I'll pass it to you.
Yeah, I mean, I would obviously co-sign everything you said, including the praise of the Ideas on Fire folks, which we'll get back to again later and embarrass you all. But I would say a few things I would add to what Liz just noted. For me, the main thing that peer review should do, is really inform the author about how to better your book. That is really in the abstract, and obviously I understand there are pragmatic concerns about your first book for everybody on this webinar. I'm sure there are contractual, for your position, things you have going on in your mind. You may need it for a contract for, say, a position you're applying for, whatever it may be. But ultimately, peer review, at least in the abstract, should really be viewed as something that's about improving your work, helping you constructively see where there are oversights in your project. And by that, specifically what Temple's looking for, but I would say this is true of any press I've been at or any editor I know at other presses. One of the central things we're looking for in peer review, especially as Liz has noted, this is a very human process in a lot of ways, is does this book that you're either proposing with sample materials appended, and again, what we send out for peer review and for who and how, that's something I'm sure we'll get into, but whether it's a proposal with sample materials or a full manuscript, the central question for me as an editor for the press is, does this theoretically cohere? And I say that maybe with a lowercase t, if you will, because some books are more theoretical than others. Some are very practically oriented, but wherever they fall on that spectrum, does the through line remain across the book? Does the central thesis actually, is it examined and explored in chapter 3 and chapter 4? Is it complicated further? Peer reviewers are there to help us as editors disentangle those nuances across the book to make sure that the sense that we have of it on a macro level is true on the more micro level as well, right? And I would say again, we can talk about specific subject areas that myself or Liz acquire in, of course, and the specificities with those specific lists, sublists, fields, but by and large, for me, the central thing is, as Liz has said, we don't send things out typically. I would be the same, unless I already felt confident about the book and some central part of its argument in some way, and also in it fitting with what we do at Temple. So if it's reached that stage, it's really a matter of what can the author do? What kinds of things can they bring to the fore to make this a stronger book that that centers their voice even more clearly and effectively, because the peer reviewers are not there, again, irrespective of the type of book, and I'm maybe leaving STEM out for the moment as I've never edited that, but, at least in the humanities or more qualitative social sciences broadly, I would say really the critical thing here is, if you're an interdisciplinary scholar and you're working with ideas on fire, do these disciplinary dialogues connect? Do they feel like they're in isolation? These are the kinds of questions that speak back to that theoretical center or that argumentative center that I mentioned. No matter what type of book you're publishing, one of the hardest things to do is really have your thesis statement carry through across the whole book, as silly as that can sound sometimes. So for me, that is one of the central elements of peer review, irrespective of your field, subject area, because ultimately, speaking to Liz's point about the process as well, that's what's going to inform myself as the editor that you're working with, or whichever editor you're working with at any given press, on what they do next with those reports, right? Because as Liz mentioned, this functions differently than journal publishing in a way. What might lead to a full contract, advanced contract, and again, those are discourses that are part of this, but maybe for another time or today later. But the nature of the kind of contract we might offer, the way we contextualize the book to our faculty advisory board, how we sort of contextualize those peer reviews themselves. Again, this is a very human process, at least at Temple, but every press I've been at, in a way. So what I would say is, really the key thing here is how you're attending to the central argument in your book and how that carries through is ultimately the main thing we're thinking about. Because a member of our faculty advisory board, and we'll go into these points later as well, how different presses approve the peer reviews or whatever, I'm sure. But, here at Temple, we have members of our architecture school. We had somebody from our dental school as well as the law school. They're not all, humanists working in disability studies, or things like that, although we have them as well, I will say, but this is to say, really, ultimately, when they're looking at the peer reviews, they're going to want to get a sense of what is this book doing that translates even outside of its immediate field. It's not just that the peer reviewers are reading back to you in narrativizing in a way what your book is doing and therefore what you can do to improve it, but how does it read legibly even just on a basic level? There's that level too, because as editors, we might be in the weeds a little bit too much to catch that bigger macro picture of, again, how does this speak to the broader dialogues that are beyond its individual field? And that's why I would say, without going into a million nodes here too far, peer review is all informing the way that we internally understand what the book is doing, seeking to do, who it's for, and how it fits with what we do. And the peer review is all a part of helping us break that down, analyze it, and think through the next steps for the book. Sorry, Liz. Yeah.
Oh no, and I mean, I think like we're sort of speaking in these generalities, but to be clear, like every press has guidelines for peer
Right.
reviewers.
Yes.
Now, as with any academic situation, you'll send people guidelines. Some people will read them, some
Right.
people will use them, some people will follow them to like a beautiful biblical T. Some
Mhm.
people will never open the attachment and will write whatever the hell they want. And both ways are totally fine.
Mhm.
But like, yeah, so like literally the first question on the Duke peer review guidelines is what is the primary contribution or argument of the proposed
Precisely.
publication? What is the importance of this work in terms of original content or perspective? So that's
Mhm.
like number one. That's like the first question that we're asking. Then from there, all of the questions get a little bit more detailed and nuanced. And there's questions about the strengths of the work, the weaknesses of the work, the audiences for the work.
Mhm.
Would you teach it in a class? What kind of class would you teach it in? How is the writing style? How is the organization? How are the images? Um, how does it relate to other works in the field? So we're asking people these specific questions as kind of the main points that we want the peer reviewers to cover. We also have, I think, like I'm looking at a folder on my other screen. There's like 10 different types of guidelines because we have different guidelines if it's an edited collection, if we're sending out a completed manuscript,
Right.
if we're sending out a proposal in sample chapters, if we're sending out a proposal for a trade book, if we're sending out, we like have
Mhm.
poetry peer review guide. So we are trying to guide the readers to give the author helpful feedback. And I have definitely, in a few cases, had to go back to peer reviewers to be like, could you expand?
Mhm.
Because of course this is another part of the academic hidden curriculum, which is that like no one teaches you how to write a peer review.
Right.
And so that's like often when we're thinking about who to ask to do the peer reviews, um, because everyone is overworked, and again, especially in these interdisciplinary subject areas where people are often right jointly appointed, so might already have more service work, where people are holding many, sometimes multiply marginalized identities, and so also doing that kind of emotional and political work on their campuses, where people are often responsible for care work in their personal and professional lives, like all of these things. So peer review is like one tiny part
Mhm.
of what we're asking people to do. And so I think trying to like not waste people's time. So trying to make sure the manuscript is ready for
Mhm.
review and is relevant is like something we think this person will be interested in.
Yeah.
That can be a real enticement for someone to peer review a book is for them to keep up with what is happening in their field.
Mhm.
So that's also where like us as editors, we know like, oh, this person is working on this topic, even though their last book was about this other topic. Maybe they'll want to read this book because they need to know what's going on with like
Right.
the Sphinx as a concept
Mhm.
because they're on a fellowship in Greece. This like literally is a thing that happened to me. I was like asked someone to peer review a book and she was like, oh, I'm going to Greece. And I was like, oh, do you want to read this other book about sphinxes? Anyway, so I think a lot of people right don't always have the time to read books, and so some like especially mid-career faculty do peer review to keep up with the literature in their field, which is great
Mhm.
because then they know what's coming out. They know they can like plan to assign the book, plan to have the author come to campus, and start to already kind of build community and conversation around the book even before it's published. And that's a really important part of peer review as well. And so I think to build on Sean's point too about interdisciplinary discourses, I would say it's sometimes rare that we have the perfect reader. Like I'm right now I'm also working on a book about like the high modernist capital of Nigeria, Abuja. It's a boring city. It's a high modernist capital. There's not that much written about it. So there aren't a lot of people out there who are like experts on this city
Mhm.
that I can send the book to. So I have to think about like, okay, so could I send it to like someone who knows things about Nigeria and then someone who knows things about like high modernist planning? So I'm sort of trying to think about like what are the pools of expertise that need to be covered. And like obviously I'm not going to publish a book on Nigeria that no one who works on Nigeria has peer reviewed. That would be irresponsible. But there might be another piece of the pie that I need to make sure is also covered. And sometimes it might be that there's like multiple things at work, right? So this is not
Mhm.
only a book about high modernist city planning, but it's also a book that's trying to kind of connect Black studies and African studies, which are two fields that don't always talk to each other. And so I might end up like hoping that the author can cover the high modernism piece, or that the Nigerianist might know enough about kind of the planning history of Nigeria to speak to that, and then get someone from Black Studies who can really speak to, like, will readers in Black Studies resonate with the way that that scholarship is being used to theorize this example from the continent. And so that is something that I think we're always really carefully thinking about, is making sure that the peer reviewers have complementary skill sets, whether it's site or method or field. Because the last thing that we would want in interdisciplinary studies also is for, like, one field to be used to kind of, like, punish the other field. And I think that is sometimes a very strong temptation for people who are trained in traditional fields and then discover interdisciplinary scholarship to be like, well, geography is bad, and I'm going to use queer theory to show geographers why they're bad and they should feel bad. And it's like, I'm not going to disagree with you that there are certain biases and assumptions and traditions built into the field of geography that I too would love to unsettle. But if you want geographers to read your book, you actually need to explain to them why it would be so great to consider this queer theoretical approach and how it would enhance their own practice of geography, as opposed to telling them that their field is bad and they should feel bad. And so I think trying to work with authors before peer review to get to that stage, and then send the book out to people in those fields to see how it's landing differently. And that is where you get kind of some of the real tensions in interdisciplinary scholarship, right? It is sometimes very challenging to navigate when you have one peer reviewer that's like, I need more archival citation, and one peer reviewer that's like, I need more theoretical citation. And meanwhile, it's like, the book manuscript can't be over 90,000 words. So, and so that's also what an editor is there to help you do, is to try to kind of navigate and thread those particular needles.
Definitely. And one thing I would just add to that, going back to this question of like specific lists you're building or types of books that you publish, and related to the questions you ask. Further to your point, just using a concrete example here as well, without divulging too much information about its review process. But we had a book recently that published last year, Mapping Asiatown, Cleveland, and this book was sort of at the vectors between urban studies, Asian American studies, was sort of the overlaying interdisciplinary field that it was coming from, but it had urban studies in it, his history in it, in the sort of way that historians understand it, cultural criticism, things like that. And so in a book like that, there's the element of you need to find the person, as Liz was saying, that might know X or Y. But additionally, this is a big part of what we're doing, another part in peer review, even beyond the selection of the readers making sense for that book. Another thing is, in shaping what we're asking, oftentimes, what we do at Temple is, if it's a book like that, where really you can see chapters that are sort of the history chapter or sort of the urban studies chapter, even though it's not that neat, of course, maybe asking them like, okay, can you add a little bit more about this section? We are interested in your particular thoughts on it because they are the specialist more familiar with that or this, that's one way of guiding a reader to say, okay, even if maybe theoretically they're not going to jibe with everything, this is kind of why what we're interested in knowing from you. And sometimes adding those conceits can be helpful without overprescribing, of course, because really, again, we want to make sure the reader is right for a book no matter what. Just because even if somebody has the perfect profile on paper, there may be any multitude of things, behind the scenes that you don't know about that might make them not an ideal reader, So this is the sort of thing, as Liz noted, we're thinking about this really critically, and even sometimes the questions that we might tailor a little bit for any individual reader will have in mind what we're looking, again, for them to sort of comment upon. But equally, this is where I would bring back this point about the human nature of it. This is also where, when we're bringing the project forward or interpreting those reports, what a geographer, to your point there for your book, Liz, is going to say to bear on the queer theory part, we're going to think about it with that in mind too. It's one thing to, also note to them, you need to make sure this translates. But then on the other hand, there is an element, for my books at least, I can say, well, how do you make sure your point is clear, but you're not that historian, so you don't need to do that book? That's what a lot of this is about. Or even when we're presenting later for approval processes, interpreting that for others as well is important. When we speak with our editorial director, if we have a more middling report, a positive report, and maybe another middling report, contextualizing them in what those readers are bringing to this particular project is also important. Or, getting a sense of their understanding of the field as a whole, and contextualizing with the other reports is critical. So this is a long-winded way of saying, really we're interpreting all those things the whole time, though. And that's why we ask some guided questions too, as well, as Liz noted.
One of the things that I like to tell authors is that peer review reports give you really important feedback and like data
Mhm.
about how your book lands with specific readers,
Mhm.
which is not a perspective that as an author you're prior to sharing it with other humans that you have access to, right? Like you know how it lands with you know what you are trying to do in it. Presumably you've gotten collegial feedback in some capacity on it. But peer review reports really are the chance where you see how it is heard by people usually that you've never met or at least never worked with directly in that fashion. And that's gold. Like that's so helpful to you as you try to figure out, how do I better speak to them? If they misunderstood something, what does that tell me about the way that I'm trying to explain this important concept? And how can I change the way I explain it so that it lands better or it is heard correctly or in the manner that I want it to be heard by the people that I care about? And you only get that feedback by giving it to another human and having them read it.
And I'll say too, it's like, so I always ask authors like for a list of recommendations of folks that I should send their work to. And then also for a list of people who they'd prefer not read their work. And I
Yeah.
don't need to know why.
Right.
I mean, there's
Yeah.
certain people that we would never send it to. Like we wouldn't send it to someone who was on your dissertation committee if it's a first book, or who's at the institution that you did your PhD at, or someone who's your current colleague or someone who you've co-authored with. Ideally, we'd prefer to not send it to like a romantic partner or ex, though that is sometimes unavoidable. But we don't need to know why you don't want us to
Mhm.
send the work to someone. We want the book to get this fair,
Right.
excited, engaged reading. And so if there's someone who you know is not a good reader of your work, we don't want to send your work to them. But and we take the recommendations of people seriously too. Although I will say that I don't think Saidiya Hartman reads a lot of first book manuscripts for university presses, or neither does Judith Butler. So just FYI. Um, so I think what is not helpful, like I think what Kathy said is helpful, right? Is like imagining the report as the stand-in for like a group of readers. Like this is, this person didn't get what I was trying to do as a historian. But what's not helpful is to try to be like, well, that's just Kathy's read, and this is what she
Mhm.
thinks, and she's always on about this, and this.
Mhm.
And like, I have had multiple authors try to like tell me who they think their readers are. And if they're right, it's not helpful. And if they're wrong, it's also not helpful. And it's sort of funny. But like, trying to like read between the lines of the peer review to identify the specific person that did it is like deeply unhelpful. So I just like, that is why we keep our readers anonymous, even if they say they're fine with being disclosed, because the idea is that the reports are supposed to stand in for groups of potential audiences, not as like one woman's opinion.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
I'm curious where in both the peer review process and the revision process based on those peer reviews do you most often see authors benefit from bringing in developmental editing support?
Yeah, so I guess I can take this first. I would say most of my authors, well, I shouldn't say this because there's no rule at all, but a lot of authors I work with, sort of would come in with a developmental editor about maybe 1 to 3 points in the process. And this is just my experience. I'm sure Liz, you'll have others, but I would say most authors I work with tend to either do it before they actually formally submit anything. Now, is that necessary? Is it the right approach for any individual? I don't know. That depends on a lot of factors, but they're always great, when you see it because you're working with somebody that's seen a proposal and what it should look like. But a lot of folks I know will have worked with somebody before they submit so that they feel comfortable knowing, okay, as an example here, folks I know that have worked with Ideas on Fire before they sent it through, they know, okay, what kinds of questions is this press going to ask? What are the things they're looking for? What do they really need to know? Just to get a sense of, is this even something that we want to read all the sample materials for? And looking at that from a perspective of, is this the right place for it? Not, is this good or bad, to be clear. But a lot of people will do that so that they feel confident in what they send through. Um, a lot of folks I know will also do it if maybe there's a revise and resubmit recommendation from a peer review process, which again, we can break that down further if that's helpful. But, in the interest of this question, many folks will take those reports, the comments from the internal editor, or say if it's in a series, the series editors are being considered for a series, or, maybe if it's gone to other points in the process, here at Temple. Additionally, one thing I'd mention, anything that we send out for peer review, and different presses do this as well, sort of goes before a full team of editors and the press director and marketing director, so we all can get a sense of how does this not just fit with my list as me and an individual editor, but how does this speak to our broader program, the broader movements in our press, the things that we want to represent in the forthcoming list. So we have those conversations first, and sometimes those comments will also be a part of what the author works on before they resubmit. But then there are plenty of folks as well, that I would say that they have a good peer review process. It gets a contract if it's a first book, and this is where different presses can vary, but just in principle, I would say whether it's a full contract or advanced contract, depending on what kind of review process that was, again, we can get there. But long story short, a lot of authors will do it after the contract is completed as well, because that's where you have all of the comments. You can really get into the nitty-gritty as you're continuing to complete the project, as the manuscript is completed, and feeling confident in it before it either goes out for its final approval review, if it's an advanced contract, or before it goes to the editor or series editors for a last look before it goes to press or the publication process. So this is a way of saying, I would say most authors I work with bring people in at those three times, but really, I don't see a bad time, and I'm not just saying that because I'm here, and know Kathy, but this is to say, like, truly, developmental editing, I don't know of any book I've ever worked on that couldn't use some level of developmental editing, my own writing included. That's having another person really help you get outside of your own head in individual sections, whether it's in an early phase, so that you know how to explain these complicated thoughts that are in your head, on the page, so that an editor who may or may not be a specialist in your field, or may not even be the right editor for you, will understand, at least in principle, what it is helpful. Folks that take those peer reviews and then use someone who can go in there in the level of detail that maybe an acquisitions editor can't, especially. We would all love to only be looking at Word docs, I'm sure, all day. But the reality, I'm sure Liz can attest to, is we are on the phone and email in spreadsheets more than anyone that's an editor, I imagine, would ever want to be in a spreadsheet. So this is a way of saying developmental editors also can go into some depth, sometimes on like a sentence level, even, that an acquisitions editor can't necessarily for every book. And so I don't see a bad time, but really those are the three spaces that usually I would see, with oftentimes, probably the first and the latter being the most common, but, I'll open that.
Yeah, I totally agree with Sean's point about the timing. I guess maybe this is again a time to just explain the process here, since Sean, you had outlined a little bit about how things work at Temple. So here at Duke Press, for first books, we strongly prefer to send out a completed manuscript. And that's because I think for a first book, when you're trying for the first time to extend an argument across an arc that could be, between 50 and 100,000 words, it's really helpful for you to take your best shot at it. To really figure out what it is that you think, how you want to organize the information, what your authorial voice is, the tone, the pacing, etc. So a lot of people can find it helpful in the process. So, I can start talking to people like before they defend their dissertation, and then 8 years later, and 3 postdocs and tenure track positions later, they're submitting their book manuscript. So there could be like a long talking stage before we're actually sending anything out for review. And at that stage, to Sean's point, I'm offering maybe feedback on an introduction, or maybe high level feedback like, oh, you sent me your new version of chapter 4. Why are you still defining the title concept in chapter 4? That's a great question for an acquisitions editor to ask. High level feedback. But I cannot be like, I'm not a writing coach. I can't check in routinely. I don't like to read like iterative drafts. I like to see here is my best version of this, and then offer feedback. Whereas again, a developmental editor can help someone devise a plan for how to get from one thing to another, can set up those like accountability check-ins and deadlines and stuff like that, can read those iterative drafts depending on the kind of arrangement and support that is available, but I think developmental editors offer a much wider range of that kind of support. And so that is really important. So we do strongly prefer to have a completed manuscript to send out to peer reviewers here at Duke Press. Part of the reason for that is that our editorial advisory board, which is comprised of Duke faculty who have all published a book and all have tenure, they see the project at the very end of the process. So the contract at Duke Press is an internal process. It's a staff committee. It's the editors kind of saying, here's why I think we should do this book. Here are two supportive peer reviews, and here's the author's plan for revision. And I think this is going to be an important boundary pushing book. In part, the fact that we don't have that editorial board oversight at the contract stage, I think is part of what helps us to be so boundary pushing and interdisciplinary, because we can sign up whatever we want and then work with the author to make it work for the faculty board. And so then the faculty board is seeing a totally complete peer review process. So by the time we're taking things to our faculty board, 95% of things have gone through at least 2 rounds of peer review. So there's an initial round of peer review. There's an internal contract process that is a full contract. We only offer one kind of contract. The author goes and revises, submits the revised manuscript, and then we send the revisions back out, ideally to one of the reviewers from the first round, assuming they were helpful then and are willing and able now. And then once we have a sign-off report from one of those readers, sometimes both of them, then we will take it to the editorial advisory board for final approval. And so because all of our books need to be signed off on before they can be approved, sometimes it is a quicker path to a contract to send out a proposal and 2 chapters, but it can actually extend the peer review process, because if peer reviewers are seeing the full manuscript for the first time in the second round of review, they may have more feedback on the full manuscript. They may say, in the proposal, you said you were going to do this and this and this, but in the manuscript, you've done this and this and this, and I don't like that as much. Or now that I see what you mean by juxtaposing ethnographic and historical detail, I think there's too much of this one. Or I think the chapters should be separated into parts, or I think the chapters should be interwoven. Like, there's more room for the readers to feel like they have latitude to comment if they're seeing the full manuscript for the first time in the second round, which could mean that it is, again, at Duke, more likely for there to need to be a third round of review before we can take it to the editorial board for final approval. So I think that's part of why we strongly encourage people to submit full manuscripts for first books. And that's also why it can be useful to work with the developmental editor even before you submit to the press, as long as you're staying in conversation with editors at the press to make sure that the development is developing along the lines that will continue to make the book a good fit. And then also at these stages, as Sean mentioned, when you have this concrete feedback where you are developing a plan of action, that can be another great time to partner with a developmental editor on how you're going to execute that plan. And really, I'm happy to work with people. I hate spreadsheets. I prefer not to look at them, but what I do love are calendars and timelines. So I love working backwards with people to be like, what needs to be in a tenure file? When does it need to be there? What are our internal deadlines that will help you meet that? But it's, again, really a developmental editor who can dig into the weeds with you and help you really kind of make sure that you're hitting those milestones.
I guess, well, Kathy, actually, just to add on to that briefly, at Temple, and I say this, I guess it's just a brief background further about me. So I'm at Temple. I've been here since March 2020 of all times to start a job. But I'm grateful for that, of course. But yeah, so I've been here. We are about, 15 people at the press. We're pretty small. So, I've also been at a large commercial academic press, and I've been at a large university press as well, and in turn starting my career at a mid-sized one. So this is all to say all places work a little different. But at Temple specifically, and I can say when it comes to first books, some of our philosophy, or my philosophy individually as an editor, because even my colleague in sociology might disagree with this a little bit, at the press, but at Temple, sort of the way we approach it is advanced contract and full contract. Since we're on this topic briefly, we internally view them the same. The difference in our contract is just that the advanced contract specifically has a line in there that says this will go, like, I'm paraphrasing, but it will go out for a final approval review before it's published, right? That's the only distinction in our contracts. But so I say that just to say, pretty much any place I've ever worked and any editor I know, advance or full, if you're getting a contract and it's a commitment to the book from that press, to clearly state that. But in terms of our process, again, we can review based on proposals with sample materials, and those should be body chapters, generally, or full manuscripts from the outset. But really, ultimately, for us, the thing that we think about, in that process, especially as a smaller press, and part of the reason I came here, other than the list, of course, and the love of Philadelphia and wanting to be here, is really that I have some more latitude and time actually to do some of that thing that reflects developmental editing, at least, than I did in previous roles where I had a larger list. So this is a way of saying, for us, what we think about when it comes to that, or when I recommend a developmental editor versus, I can give you some feedback along the way at whatever stage that may be, whether you're under contract or not. Really, for me, is sort of the level of depth that they're going to need. Even if I can go in and read chapters that are iterative, actually, in a way, that's part of why I love working here at Temple, actually. On the contrast to that would be, at the end of the day, I am not somebody who is a specialist at just helping people organize those thoughts. I'm a macro level person by the way my mind works. I'm not a developmental editor by trade for a reason. There's a reason folks like Kathy, can do this. It's a specific skill as well, so that's where I would say, irrespective of in an internal press's review processes, where they come in, I still always find it helpful because, really at the end of the day, that writing coach element that you sort of mentioned, Liz, I think is a critical part of that. Editors' jobs are just categorically, or acquisitions editors' jobs are a little different categorically, and the way we'd work with an author on the peer review reports even might be a little bit different than someone who is there to help you on page 5 of chapter 3 to work that out, So this is all to say, though, I just mentioned that because, whether it's like what Liz said and where you would come in, how review process works, or us, the key thing is, a developmental editor is always going to improve the book, because ultimately it's honing the ideas, it's clarifying the ideas, and really thinking through how that reads, as Liz said, to people that are maybe not your immediately obvious audience, which is important for interdisciplinary scholars, I would say. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'd also just say a little bit more about like what our job actually is, since we've
Yeah.
said a lot about what our job isn't. And I think what we're thinking about, and this goes back to the selection of peer reviewers, the thinking about audience, we are really thinking about the shape of our list. So presses have lists, all editors have lists. So it's like kind of it's a jargony publishing word. So maybe I just want to unpack that for a second. So what the presses list is like all of the books that we're publishing. And then we might say we have lists in American studies, queer theory, Black studies, anthropology, Latin American history, environmental history. So it can be anything from a huge macro field like sociology to like a section of a section of a section. And I think individual acquisitions editors are building kind of pieces of that go together. And some presses, it's very defined. It's like, because I go to the sociology meeting, which is hilarious to me, because I was a student of Rod Ferguson, whose most famous book is A Critique of Canonical Sociology. So now I'm like talking to canonical sociologists. But hopefully, right, like part of the reason I'm going is to try to like build a slightly different kind of list in the field to make a home for a slightly different kind of sociology in the world of sociology. Because I go to sociology and I go to American studies and I go to women's studies, right? And there aren't a lot of editors that do that. So what I'm looking for there are books that will help me build the list that I want to build in sociology. Whereas other presses send editors to sociology who are there to find the best 25 books in sociology. They go to the national meeting, they might go to regional sociology meetings, they might go to like criminology as well, or they might go to an education meeting, but they are the sociology editor and they're looking for 25 sociology books. So that's because, again, our job titles are acquisitions editors. So like we have, sometimes we have performance evaluations annually. And it's like we're evaluated on like how many books did you put under contract? How many books did you get into production? Because part of the reason I have a job is because Duke Press has contractual commitments to our library partners to publish 150 books a year. And we have budgetary commitments that are based on us having 150 books a year. And so if I'm not holding up my part of that list, we might not have 150 books a year. Less of our goal is like, oh, was it a good book? Award winning, great. That's always fun. But so just to say that like my job as an editor building a list is different than another editor at the same meeting. And the way that I'm thinking about a project and its fit for my press is also my own specific interests. And I think at Duke, the boundaries are much blurrier. It's like much less clear, like who to submit to. We send 3 editors to American Studies. It's a 2,000-person meeting. Like, why are we doing that? I mean, I know why we're doing that. It's because it's like, I think the most exciting intellectual engine that is sort of in conversation across a huge range of the most high stakes and important issues of our time. As an American Studies PhD, I am not biased. So, but yeah, so I think that's a little abstruse when people are talking about fit and list. So I guess I just wanted to say a little bit more about like what that is and what that means, and how that affects what we are looking for as acquisitions editors, the way a project might fit into a certain niche in our list or help us push a conversation forward in a specific way. And so the way that you as a first-time author might think about building a relationship with an editor could be like, oh, there's a new editor trying to build a list in my field. And so how can I work with them to do that? Or you might conversely be like, oh, I'm a new person and I'm being told that I have to publish with one of 5 presses in order to get tenure. So now I have to figure out how to develop my project in such a way that it can be a fit for one of those presses.
Definitely. I think looking at time, I'd like to turn to some of the questions that are posed from the audience because I think they get at some of the things that we've been talking about and some of the things that I was hoping we'd get a chance to chat about. So somebody posts what I think is a really helpful question and that I get a lot as an editor, and I'm sure you both do in your roles as well, is which kinds of reviewer comments should authors prioritize responding to, and which one of them are more kind of negotiable, or which ones can they leave toward the end of the list?
Just to answer that briefly, and as an editor, I feel like I always give like qualified answers, but I feel like this I feel confident in, although maybe Liz will completely disagree. But really at the end of the day, anything that relates, kind of like I said at the top, and this is my takeaway that I give a lot of authors. A lot of authors I coach, or not coach, or I work with, I should say, I say, put the thesis statement of your book in the proposal. And then does everything actually lead back to that? Is sort of what I asked just as an exercise. That's the same thing here. Is this book really, is your theoretical framing, and again, even if that's an overly complex way to put it for your individual book, maybe it's a very informal book, that's kind of irrespective or unimportant for a moment. But does your theoretical framing cohere? And does your argument flow? Does it make sense? Do the chapters interconnect with one another? Really, for me, that's another way of saying, is your argument clear? And anything that extends from that is what I always prioritize. So that's another way of saying, really the peer reviewers are there as peer reviewers. They're there to let us know, even if you have a PhD and did a postdoc yourself in a certain area, what someone is writing is going to be something that's different at a different time. Even if you're a specialist, you won't be able, as an editor, you won't be able to evaluate everything at that level. Peer reviewers are there to tell us about how the argument flows. At the same time, we have a question, and most presses have a question about market in some way or audience in some way. For me, that is less important a lot of the time what a reviewer will say about that, because really, while I do want to know like how they envision the market, and that informs how this is actually translating, a lot of those decisions related to how it's published or things like that are actually going to be ours internally to make and aren't as much about the content of the book itself. So there is a distinction, just to clarify that, between, does this make sense to the audiences the author has set out to try and reach? That's a content question, versus oftentimes we'll get review comments that say, well, if you want this to be more accessible, you should probably get rid of a lot of this jargony area here. Another reader might say the opposite, kind of like what Liz said, if they're more theoretically oriented. That's where we are thinking then about, okay, well, what would we do as this press for this book? How would we position it? And having a conversation with the author about that and how what we're imagining fits what they're doing. So this is, again, a long-winded way of saying anything related to the central argument and how it coheres is always most important to me. Least important, I guess, would be how you're going to then mold things to fit imagined people or even the press itself. Because to be blunt, and this is something about being at a smaller press that I actually enjoy, there are books that peer review actually surfaces that we are not the right press for the book. And that doesn't mean they're negative reviews even. They might be real, to be clear, so to me, really a critical part of it is helping you hone what you are saying, and that's the central takeaway. That's what you should be focusing on in your reviews, rather than, again, the one person kind of idea that Liz, sort of outlined. How an argument carries to a field is really the question, less what does one individual person think about how this book might do on, this introductory course across the country. We'll do our research about that, talk to marketing and say how it might work in introductory courses. Or if we're asking that, it's going to be in a guided way, So that's kind of one way of answering it. Sorry, Liz.
You don't have to apologize. Thank you. I am listening intently. I am learning. Thank you, Sean. Also, when I send reports to an author, I don't just say, here are the reports, have fun. I'm usually spending quite a bit of time with the reports myself before I send them to the author, kind of vetting them, reading through them, getting a sense of where do the reports overlap, what's the feedback that's actionable. And I'll tell the author straight up, like, here's what I don't think you need to agonize over. Here's where I think the reader might have gotten it wrong. And also in a response for a book peer review, you can say, I disagree
Absolutely.
with the reviewer, and here's what I'll do instead. The key thing is not, because again, I think sometimes with journal peer review, it's more like just accept all the suggestions and that's what you need to do to get published. With book peer review, if you write a response that just says, I accept all the suggestions, it's going to kind of look like you're not actually engaged.
Right. Yeah.
So what we want you to do is to really engage. Like, right, so much of writing a book is about you're entering into a conversation, and that's what peer review is too. So we really want to see you engage, not to be defensive and combative. No. But to say, like, this I think is great. This really affirms my vision for the book. I was thinking about this section doing this work, and I see it's not doing that. So I will change it to make sure it does this instead. So I think it's not always about accepting all of the changes.
Absolutely.
But it's really just about engaging the feedback to say, here's maybe where I fell short, or here's where this person didn't quite see what I was doing. And so here's what I will do. I'm not going to do the thing they're saying to do to fix the problem. I'm going to fix the problem this way. And so much of what I am sending in, like, so I usually have a head note before I send the reports that's like a pretty meaty paragraph. And I'm always happy to like dig into reports with an author. That's like, that's the best part of my job. Like, it's Christmas for me when I'm like, we got reports, like I get to send them. That's like a party. I love it so much. Even if the reports are complicated, it's like an interesting problem for me to think about working with the author to solve. And so I think your editor, in addition, like your press editor, in addition to your developmental editor, is a really important resource in helping guide you through that response. Because guess what? That's another academic genre that nobody is taught how to write.
Definitely.
And so I think it's like, I'm not going to get the response and be like, well, I guess I'll send it on to other people. No. If I get the response and I'm like, I think you've missed the boat slightly, I will say, let's dig in here.
Yes.
And then even sometimes, I just got a manuscript back where one of the key points in the initial round of review was like, there's this new book that's just come out that maybe you didn't have time to fully digest while you were working on the manuscript, which is fine, which happens. But now by the time the book comes out, the other book will be 2 or 3 years old. And so you actually really do need to digest it and deal with it. And what the author did in revision was they cited it. And so when I got that revision back, I said, I'm glad that you've gone back and incorporated these ideas more, but you're still not actually engaging them. You've cited the book, but every time that you cite it, it's the end of a paragraph. You're just ending the paragraph with a quote from this other scholar. And it's like, I actually need you to dig in and tell me what is at stake for your argument in this. And so that's, again, the kind of like back and forth and engagement that I think acquisitions editors can help authors with, in addition to developmental editors, and in addition to thinking about, again, what is the goal of the peer review process, to produce a really like an important and clear book that can connect with its readers and acknowledge kind of the other things that they might have read, the things that they're hoping the author will cover, even if that's not the author's core focus.
Yeah, I
So
mean, one thing I would just maybe that synthesizes what I'm saying, but also speaking to your point, Liz, a little more clearly is I just realized there's this phrase that always comes out of me, irrespective of the rest of the setting on like whatever notes I have, when setting on reports, which is always something along the lines of like, while you may not agree with everything they've offered, essentially the idea is we want to see how you're going to shore up your position. That's really the idea. Like, that's really critical to note. Just because a peer reviewer has suggested something doesn't mean that's the right approach to take. The way that you manage that, and actually to that specific point, Liz, I think it's really important to note, whether it's speaking with your acquisitions editor, developmental editor, whoever it is, or just thinking internally, how you respond to things that you don't agree with is actually oftentimes for our board or internally some of the things that we think about the most critically. Because if you say, yes, this makes sense and I'll do it in X, Y, and Z ways, that's good. We do want to know that. But how you deal with what is essentially for potentially foreshadowing an academic debate that might emerge from your book, is just as important. So that point about engagement that Liz said, I couldn't echo that enough, but specifically as well, highlighting that idea that is kind of a representation of what maybe somebody in that field might say later in a published review or just reading the book. So that's why it's important to know what it is you want to say and address that in the response memo, because that's what gives us as a publisher confidence, or in our case, when our board is looking at the project for the first contract approval, or it's only depending on its process, that gives them the confidence to know, like, okay, not only do you understand what they said, but you know how you're going to address this, or at least have a sense of it as you're writing. So yeah.
nice. So somebody else posted a question of how long is normal for an author to take with revisions after they get peer review reports back? And I know there's no single answer to this, so I will just tell everybody, audience members here, there is no single answer. But in terms of books that you've worked on and the kind of process at your press, how do you handle that kind of timeline with authors?
I can just say, and I know I'm a loquacious person, so I'll keep it brief. For me, working backwards from whatever professional, pragmatic deadline you have is step one, as Liz noted. From there, though, I kind of tell authors this is the timeline you need to write. Like, again, being at a smaller press, this is really a critical part of it for me. I have authors who I sent reports in the fall who I've checked in a little bit. Hey, how's it going? And they said, I'm still thinking about it. I'm still working on it. Some of them, maybe it's in a series. They're working with the series editor on addressing some real minute things, and that takes a while. It's another schedule they're thinking about. Other folks, they want to get it to the board as soon as possible. They want to think about the contract. They do it quickly. We have a conversation back and forth. I might ask them to expand or whatever. But really, that's the thing. There's no set time, as you said. But the key thing is I will always try to work backward from what timeline you're trying to hit and advise you on when you should kind of have this done accordingly. Accounting for everything always takes a little bit longer, at least, than you think it's going to.
Yes, my short answer to that is longer than you want to think.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. That's true too. Yeah.
Nice,
but sometimes
nice.
that is something. So in the response to the reviews, you'll include things like practical details, like the final word count. Also, that's important. I think especially like in proposals, sometimes people are thinking in terms of pages. It's like you teach undergraduates, pages are fake. We care about the word count. Which is why that's what I've kept mentioning. So word count, image count, and timeline is something you'll put in the response. And so that's something we can also talk about. Realistically, again, what is your tenure timeline or your promotion timeline, or what are your care responsibilities? What is your teaching load?
Yeah.
How many grad students do you have defending? When are you realistically going to be able to do these revisions? How much, like sometimes the revisions might be calling for you to travel back to your archive. That's going to be a different timeline than, reading this new book in your field. But then also reading the new book in the field is a different timeline than actually metabolizing and engaging the book in your field. So I always encourage people to be really generous, and you can always hand it in early. You can always turn it in early. I would say, like, give yourself more time than you think you're going to need. Because of how our process works, we want to send the revised manuscript back out to readers who are going to sign off on it. And so if you have already vetted it with your own internal readers, then there's, that also gives us more confidence that our readers will be able to sign off on it. So I would say that's another thing you kind of want to build into your timeline.
Nice. Okay, so we are at time, and I just want to thank all of you for joining us today to talk about the process of peer review, the joyous, generous process of peer review. And I hope you are coming away with some ideas for how to navigate that on your own book. I do want to thank Sean and Liz. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your advice and insight into how your individual presses handle this as well. I think that's really helpful. So all of you who are registered for this, you're going to receive a recording of this within the next week or so. So keep an eye on your inbox. And finally, don't forget to join us for the next webinar in the series, which is about publishing in a series for your first book. And that's coming up on March 2nd. I put a link to register for that in the chat, but you can also find the link on our website. So thank you all for being here, and I will see you all next time.
Thanks so much, Kathy. Thanks everyone for coming. And giving me the chance to yammer about peer review, which is one of my very favorite things. And if you have any other questions, Sean and I are both very findable.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the thing, just in closing, the worst thing you can do is just not get a response from somebody who's busy. Anyone in these fields, though, I feel like we're going to get back to you, at a minimum, it's just to let you know, like, if something's not right for me, we try to let you know that if something's right, we'll do that. But any questions, we're here to help you demystify this too. Like a lot of first meetings I have with people, again, maybe the book's not right, but we can help send you to the right place, so this is a way of saying feel free to reach out. Really, truly do.
Yes. Thanks, everyone. Take good care out there.
Thank you.